Let's compare desktop Macs. The Mac Mini with the M2 Pro chip versus the Mac Studio with the M1 Mac chip. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. If you have already subscribed, thank you. If you're new, welcome. Please consider subscribing because that's definitely going to help me out. As usual, I'll be sharing a lot of information. I highly encourage that you pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself, in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. There'll be timestamp below in the description. You can jump ahead. However, if you're new, I highly recommend that you sit through the introduction because it's going to give you insight for the testing methodology. And if you're finding what I'm sharing with you helpful, please consider contributing and supporting the channel either through the tip jar or YouTube Super Thanks. All the funding will come directly to me to help support the channel and running this channel, and also will go into a saving fund that I will use to purchase future hardware to run testing on this channel as well. And with this in mind, let's talk about desktop Mac. For this, we're going to be looking at two main configurations. One of them is going to be the Mac Mini with the M2 Pro, and the other one is going to be the Mac Studio with the M1 Max. Both of these are running on the base SoC, and when I refer to base or top, I'm really just talking about the silicon itself, so you can see that right there. Now on the Mac Mini, I've gone in and upgraded the memory to 32 gigabytes. This way it's on par with the Mac Studio 32 gigabytes memory, and the memory between these two are just about the same. I'll also be adding in the result from the M1 Ultra as well. This way we get a chance to really see how these machines scale up and how much further or closer it is to the M1 Ultra chip in the lineup. Next thing is test configuration. I can tell you right now that I can't go out and test every single machine combination because it is a mathematical impossibility, not to mention it's really not financially feasible. My best recommendation to you is to extrapolate the results that I'm sharing with you on the chart. For every single task running on any given app, I will share with you at the very top what resources that app is really targeting the system on for those specific tasks. I'll also share that with you verbally as well, and from there you can really start to extrapolate and build on the machine that's going to be best suited for your workflow. As usual, Apple have separated their chip into more consumer leaning and the more pro-oriented one. The one that we're looking at right now are going to be more the Pro chip, which has more high performance core, more GPU. You can link them up to more displays, and they generally have more I/O, among other things, including the more double encoder decoder engine as well, compare from the consumer generation chip. And with this in mind, I'll be taking a pro approach on this as a photographer and also one that does like video work. And all the testing you're going to see from the result are going to be on a single app testing only. It's not multitasking testing because what I don't want to do is really try to figure out how the machine is going to perform with multitasking. What I want to know is how these silicons are performing against each other from one silicon to the next, from one machine to the next. And I really want to see the performance metrics without any biases whatsoever from the multitasking. So everything has been retested on the latest operating system and the latest app that is available on both of these machines, or on all the testing machines rather. And one thing that I want to mention about, for example, the Mac Mini with the M1 Pro and the Mac Studio is the ports. So something to think about when you're really going with the Mac Studio system is, well, a few things. Number one, there are some sales now on the Mac Studio system, so that's really a good thing. And with that sale is really giving the M2 Pro really a run for the money, so that's something to think about. But we'll talk about that closer to the conclusion. But what you do get are a few extra ports. So for example, on the Mac Studio, you get 2 extra USB ports in the front. This is with the Mac chip, and you also get an SD card reader. Another thing for us to note as well is that on the Mac Studio, this Ethernet port is 10 gigabit, whereas on the Mac Mini is only a gigabit Ethernet. If you want to upgrade to 10, you can, but you're really going to be adding in about $100 to upgrade that port. Those are some of the considerations to really think about when it comes to port. As far as Thermo and Fan goes, I would say that the machine runs fairly silent. You don't hear the fan pitching up into like a high noise or anything. If anything at all, it is a very light hum. The machine does run hot with the M2 Pro chip because the chip does run hotter, but it's nothing to really, be afraid of, and it doesn't really pitch quite as loudly as a 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro when the fan does really kick in. And this is how you're going to read the specs for the machine that I'm about to share with you on the various slide. But before we do that, let's talk about the SSD. So this is a component in the machine that you can always upgrade and expand once you configure your computer system with an external device. hard drive, SSD, a NAS, or even a DAS that you link up to the system. So when it comes to this, I highly recommend that you really just configure the system based on what you need and don't necessarily go out and really configure the machine based on the SSD speed or go in and upgrade SSD to really take the gain from that speed, because there are better ways to really utilize the resources. For example, upgrading RAM, you're going to see a much better performance out of that rather than upgrading SSD, especially if you're not going to use the capacity inside the machine. You start to see the numbers cascading right there. This is giving you an idea for how the machines are performing SSD-wise. Now, the one thing I'll also tell you is that the Mac Mini, even though, yes, it is running a little bit slower, I mean, that's still 3 gigabytes per second. That is still mighty fast. Now, I'll also leave a link to this video that I made in the description below as well. It goes over exactly how much the program is really utilizing the speed of SSD when you're really running it on a daily basis. For example, Lightroom Classic image editing and also Final Cut Pro editing and exporting. And the TLDR version of this is that it doesn't really use that much resources at all. Generally, it doesn't even use anything more than 300 megabytes per second, but I'll leave a link to that video so you can check that out yourself. So when it comes to SSD speed versus size, the best thing that you can do is configure this based on what your needs are today and what your needs are in the future. Now, when it comes to RAM, this is a component that there's no way to upgrade this post configuration. So once you have your machine, that's the amount of RAM that you're going to have. So really think about the way how you're using the machine. And because this is a desktop, it's generally going to mean a more powerful machine anyway. I might just encourage you to go in and upgrade the RAM to start out with. Now, if you're like me and you have too many browsers open with way too many tabs and multiple programs running in the background, I highly recommend that you configure the system with even more RAM. This way, when you're running all these multitasking, the program has the memory to really allocate properly to the task that it's doing and not having to slow down and go through that much swap on the SSD, which is still going to be much slower even on a faster SSD than having just the amount of RAM that you're going to need. The best thing to do to determine how much RAM you need is to restart the computer, launch Activity Monitor, especially if you're a pro, go into the memory tab and look at the memory pressure. Constantly peek at this throughout the day as you're working through it. If you're in the green, the amount of memory you have is good. If you're in the yellow or red, you probably need more memory on your system. But if you don't want to peak throughout the day, I highly recommend using a program called iStat Menu. I'm not affiliated with them. I'll leave a link to their website in the description below. I like this because it keeps track of the usage on my machine for up to 30 days, and this gives me a good metrics as to how I am using my machine. So I highly recommend looking at their app. So the question then is 16 gigabytes enough? I would say that you really need to think about your use case. For many people, 16 are going to be just fine. However, if you are a pro, I highly recommend thinking about getting 32 gigabytes of memory because that's definitely going to be the sweet spot for pros. So that's my thought there. Now, let's go into the Lightroom Classic test. This is with Ventura 13.2, Lightroom Classic version 12.1. All the machines support full hardware acceleration, and we are now looking at the result between these two machines. Yes, the Mac Mini M2 Pro with the base chip is performing slightly faster, not by much, by about 30 seconds or so, than the M1 Mac chip. I mean, it's just tuned a little bit differently, right? It's a new generation, so Apple definitely has tuned the chip, makes it run more efficiently, much better. And this is also a task that just really target the CPU on the system. Now, how does this compare to, example, the M1 Ultra? Well, M1 Ultra still cuts things in half, so this puts into perspective a little bit where these machine performance are, and I say that they are just pretty much about the same. What about when we go to export files? And by the way, mind you, these are 1,000 files we're exporting, so quite a bit. This task used both the CPU and GPU in the system. And interestingly enough, even though we have more GPU on the M1 Max, it's still a little bit slower by around less than 30 seconds or so. So that's just something to think about. Performance is on par with each other. But what you do get with the Max are a few other things that you're going to see in the chart, and in addition to the ports that I have already shared with you early on. When we compare this, for example, with the M1 Ultra, we start to see the scaling right away, and the M1 Ultra is still performing much faster than any of these machines on the block. What about HDR Merge? Timing for all these are just about the same, so it's really not an issue. There's just really 1 or 2 seconds apart. This is margin of error. How about Panorama Merge? Taking 14 Nikon D810 36 megapixel, combine them together to create a 314 megapixel DNG. Let's take a look. So, interestingly enough, the new M2 Pro is running faster. And this is, by the way, the base M2 Pro chip. This is not even the top M2 Pro chip. It's running much faster by close to 30 seconds compared to the M1 Max. So those are the things to think about. If you're predominantly a photographer, hey, you know what? The Mac Mini with the M2 Pro is looking really great, especially in all these tests. Now, when we throw in, for example, the Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra, I mean, there's really no comparison there. That is a much better machine, but it's also one that costs close to 2.5 times as much as well. So those are just factors to consider. Now, there's one more thing that I want to share about these charts as well, and that is the SSD speed. Let's bring this up one more time. You can see that the Mac Mini M2 Pro is the one with the slower SSD. However, SSD speed, even though there may be some swap happening right now, is really not playing a role because technically this machine right here, the M1 Max, is the one with the faster SSD. So this is already proving to us that SSD doesn't really play a role quite as much, especially when we configure the system with enough memory. Now let's take a look at Lightroom. This is running Ventura 13.2 with Lightroom version 6.1. All of them support full hardware acceleration, and the result is a bit reversed. And the reason why this is the case is because this task in Lightroom Cloud version used CPU, GPU, and RAM all in combination. The fact that the M1 Max have 24 GPU core, that's really showing a difference. I was really hoping that in Lightroom Classic, we would see much more improvement from the 24 GPU core. However, it's not really utilizing that well at the moment. And that's just something that I noticed in these versions of Lightroom, especially the more recent one, is that it doesn't go in and target all the resources on the machine quite as efficiently and effectively as I really wanted to. When we throw in the M1 Ultra, you can see right there that giving the system, or the program rather, more resources is definitely saving a lot of time. This is exporting 1,000 files under 3 minutes. It's really fantastic, but it gives you an idea for how the computers are scaling. Now let's take a look at CaptureOne. Ventura 13.2, CaptureOne 23 version 16.0.2. And with this in mind, interestingly enough, this is a CPU-based task only, and even though this is the same 10-core CPU, the Mac Studio is pulling up slightly ahead by close to a minute or so. Very interesting there. When we throw in the M1 Ultra, it's a little bit faster, but not by much, and this should be scaling much better, but we're never seeing that in CaptureOne, so that's just something to note. When it comes to export time, this is really just using purely and solely GPU, and with this, 24 core is still going to win out at the end of the day. So having more GPU to give it to CaptureOne, I think that's going to be better. And as I found out in my previous M1 Max test, between a 24 and a 30 GPU version, CaptureOne tends to utilize 24 GPU best because, I mean, you can throw in the extra 30 core GPU, but CaptureOne doesn't really utilize it, where the time difference is very small. But configuring with the 24 GPU, you're really saving a lot of money and getting more performance from CaptureOne. And as you can see right there, when you have only 16 core, export does take longer. Now, when we give CaptureOne all the resources possible, this is what I was saying earlier, that giving it 48 cores double this, I mean, the time should be somewhat around here, but we're not really getting that in the M1 Ultra. So those are just some of the factors to really think about. Now let's take a look at Photoshop. Between these two machines, I'm running digital Lloyd chamber tests, and these are the 3 tests that I am running. So starting with Photoshop speed, the timing for the most part are pretty much just about the same. You're not really seeing that much variation whatsoever. So speed is good to go. Now, when it comes to these machines running on a Photoshop medium with a 15.7 gigabyte file, because all of these have 32 gigabytes of memory at the minimum, I mean, this is only half the memory, so the machines are running just fine. So there's no variation in time. However, when it comes to Photoshop Huge, this is the one factor we're going to see a difference. And the difference in this comes down to both of these having 32 gigabytes of memory. The reason why this is faster is not because this is really using the GPU on the system or anything like that, but it is because the SSD on this machine is faster. Now, with this in mind, we're really only talking about a time variation that is less than a minute. And this is an extreme case where you're using 56 gigabyte file. Now, if you can say you use this on a daily basis, I would already tell you to go in and upgrade the RAM and also the SSD in your system and don't even have this conversation. So for anyone out there that may think that SSD speed is going to play a role in the performance, very little. very little, as you can see right there, less than a minute of what you're seeing right now between these two machines. And you want the top performance, we'll definitely go 64 gigabytes because that's giving the computer enough room for it to just do all the computation it needs to do without having to worry about anything at all. But with this file, that's almost double the size of the memory. This is the time variation that we're seeing, less than a minute. And that's the most you're ever going to see. So if you ever run into a task every now and then where you have to work with extremely large files, I wouldn't say this is a big deal at all. It's just something that you just have to deal with. So you can really spend the money to upgrade the SSD, but if you want the best performance, I would just tell you to upgrade the RAM. You're seeing right now, as we're increasing the RAM, speeds start to decrease significantly, right? If we take a look at SSD speed again, the Mac Studio is a little bit faster than the Mac Mini, and you're seeing that result being repeated right now. So this is just a slide again to show you the result, but it's only one task that's really being affected by all this. Now, what happens in video? When it comes to Video Pro, here's my recommendation. If you're a pro, definitely consider getting the Max or the Ultra because you can see right now the export time is in half for H.264. Same thing with HEVC. Now, if you're doing content mastering with ProRes, I mean, you're still going to get much more from the Ultra because, you know, it has more engine and everything, but otherwise, the timing are just going to be about the same. But most of the time, here's the thing. We're going to do video and we're going to have to send this to our client. We don't send ProRes to our client. We send H.264, HEVC, or some other format that is compressed. So in general, you're going to save a lot of time that way. So let's take a look at the analysis, which one to choose and how to configure these machines. So these are all valid things to think about. What I want to do is take us into a configuration page from Apple and let's walk through these machines a little bit because I think we're going to benefit from that. So starting out, what I'm going to do is, first of all, bring the memory so that it is in the same range. So I'll upgrade, for example, the Mac Mini to a 32 gigabytes of memory. And this is already the one with the M2 Pro chip. Now, this is the exact same chip that I've tested without upgrading the extra $300 to really bump up the chip itself to the top performance one. And for the SSD, we're already both at 512 on both the Mac Mini and Mac Studio. Now, the thing is the Mac Studio has a 10 gigabit Ethernet. And let's say I want to have the machine that's on par speed-wise for Ethernet. I'll type that in. And right now, I'm looking at a price variation of around $200. Mind you, there are certain sales right now that I've seen from the Mac Studio that puts the price of the machine at around $1,700, at least in the US anyway. So that's really giving a Mac Studio a compelling reason from different retailers for you to really consider that, or even consider getting a refurbished Mac Studio, because in some of the tasks you're seeing, I mean, they're not all that much faster. So that may be a machine to configure and you get much better I/O. Now here's the catch. If you've gone in and upgrade the Mac Mini to the top spec one with the 12-core CPU and 19-core GPU, we're now looking at a machine that is $100 more than the Mac Studio in order to bring everything on par. Chances are this chip is going to pull ahead on the Mac Studio by a little bit more, but when it comes to video rendering tasks, I mean, if you're on a video workflow, I would still definitely consider getting the Mac Studio with the M1 Max chip instead. One more thing I want to share with you is that if we take the 10 gigabit out and bring this down to just the gigabit, we're looking at the price as on par between the Mac Mini and the Mac Studio. So those are just some of the things to consider. There's a lot of ways to really play around with these numbers, but with the Mac Studio being on sale and you can get them on even Apple refurbished site now, I think those are the more compelling machine to look at. As much as the M2 Pro may be faster, if you can utilize some of the extra function, the capability, the GPU, the encoder-decoder engine inside the Mac Studio, the extra I/O ports, those are definitely things to consider. All right, so I hope that gives us an idea a little bit as far as which one and how we should configure this. I have created a chart for anyone upgrading from an Intel machine, or if you're considering getting into a Macintosh system, this would be something to think about based on the app they're using. For Lightroom Classic, the M2 Pro is definitely a fine machine if you only need up to 32 gigabytes of memory. Anything more, then I would definitely consider the Mac Studio with the M1 Max chip. Now, when it comes to Photoshop, here's the thing. The same memory limitation still applies to the M2 Pro, but when it comes to the M1 Max, if you're configuring that, I would say if you need more memory, then go for the M1 Max and the Mac Studio. But when you configure that, I would just choose the base M1 Max chip, so choose the base GPU, because you're really not going to need that much more than that. As far as Lightroom Classic and Lightroom goes, even though the export engine can really use hardware acceleration, having that chip bump will probably result in some time differences, but it's not going to be quite as drastic. So if you really want the best performance possible, I would probably just use the base GPU configuration. That would be my advice. When it comes to CaptureOne, M1 Max all the way, and the reason why is because CaptureOne definitely can utilize the extra GPU that are available on the system, and having more for CaptureOne to a certain extent is a good idea. And when I say more, it's just more than the M2 Pro, but not necessarily more in the M1 Max side. So choosing the base GPU configuration is definitely something that's going to work well. When it comes to video workflow, go with at least a Max, if not the Ultra, because you can really utilize that. For example, the double encoder decoder engine, it's going to make a lot of difference. As far as do you need the Ultra for video or not, I would say you don't really need that. But with any of these workflow, if you really want to go put it at the top, the Ultra is still the performing king at this point in time. Now, as far as RAM go, I would say for pro workflow, go with at least 32 at the very minimum. This way you don't have to worry about you're going to run out of memory or not. So that's the best thing to do. As far as SSD go, the minimum is 512, which I am thankful that Apple is now putting that at the minimum for these Pro machines. However, for Pros, I still recommend that you go in for a 1 terabyte because that gives you more room. It does give you more speed as well, but do it more for the room rather than for the speed, because you saw from the analysis I share with you, I mean, SSD speed doesn't really play that much of a role in this whole thing. Now, if you currently have an Apple Silicon, I have also created this chart for any Apple Silicon owner who wants to upgrade. Now, do note that not all these chips are in desktop form. For example, the M1 Pro is not inside any desktop from Apple whatsoever. So those are just something to note. But the best way to use this chart is to just put yourself and put the circle down on the current chip that you have, and go through the flowchart as how you may want to upgrade. And as usual, I always tell people that if you have an M2, it may not be a bad idea to get a good price M1 Max with more GPU in the system, especially if your task can use it, and more memory in the system, so you can get a much better performance overall at a much lower price now. So those are definitely things to really think about when you're really considering this. So going back from the M2 to the previous generation is not a bad idea. The other thing too is, rather than upgrading to the next generation up, sometimes doing a lateral move between one chip in the same generation to another higher performing chip in the exact same generation is also a way to go forward as well. So these are just some of the things to think about and consider. So as usual, I always say this, that we need to really pay attention to what we do in our workflow and really consider our needs, because the day that we just really go in and throw all our resources to buy the top configuration machine, I mean, if you want to do that, you still can, but if you want to get the most out of your resources, I would use this guide I've shared with you to really think about the process that you use your machine to do most, and what type of system resources those tasks inside those apps are really using, and configure your machine that way so you can get the maximum performance out of the machine without really overpaying for it. Anyway, I hope that you find this helpful. If you have any questions or comment, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit on the bell if you're new, and in art we trust.